The morning started like any other. The faint smell of stale coffee and old paper filled the sorting office, a scent I'd come to associate with purpose. My van, old and reliable, hummed patiently outside. On the passenger seat sat the day's deliveries, stacks of brown paper parcels, crisp white envelopes, and glossy, colorful catalogs promising lives I couldn't imagine. It was a familiar weight, a familiar routine. I am a postman. It's what I do. It's who I am. But not every route is the same. Mine is Route 19B, the one nobody else wants. It begins where the city's neat grid of streets starts to fray and unravel. You take a left past the old abandoned textile mill, its windows like vacant eyes. The road changes there. The asphalt becomes cracked and tired, surrendering to weeds. Then the fog rolls in. It doesn't matter the season or the time of day. The fog is always waiting for Route 19B. It's a soft gray wall that swallows the world behind you, leaving only the narrow ribbon of road ahead. The air grows cold and still, and the only sound is the low thrum of my engine. My deliveries out here are few and far between. Weather-beaten farmhouses set far back from the road, lonely mailboxes standing like sentinels at the end of long, muddy driveways. I rarely see the people. I just leave their packages and letters, small tokens of a world that feels miles away. But there is one delivery that is different from all the others. It's the last one on my list. Always. The address is simply the house at the end. There is no number, no street name. The manifest just lists it that way. The house itself is pristine, a stark contrast to the decay around it. It's a two-story Victorian painted a crisp, clean white, with a perfectly maintained picket fence. The windows are dark, like polished obsidian, and no car ever sits in the driveway. No child's toy has ever been left on the lawn. It looks unlived in, a photograph of a house rather than a real one. Every day, I have one letter for this house. It's always the same. A simple, elegant white envelope. There is no stamp and no return address, just a single name written in a graceful, looping script. Elias. The paper feels thin, and the envelope is impossibly light, as if it holds nothing but a whisper. I always get the same feeling walking up the short gravel path. The feeling of being watched. Not by a person, but by the house itself. The air seems to thicken, and the silence becomes heavy, pressing in on me. I slide the letter into the black, ornate mailbox. The little red flag on the side is always down when I arrive. I push it up. Click. The sound is unnervingly loud in the quiet. When I return the next day, the flag will be down again. The letter will be gone. Today, however, something was different. As I turned back to my van, a flicker of movement caught my eye. On the second floor, in the far left window, a white lace curtain swayed just for a moment before settling back into perfect stillness. It could have been a draft, but there was no wind. The fog hung motionless, and the leaves on the skeletal trees were frozen in place. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I got back into my van, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the house in my rearview mirror as I drove away. The curtain was perfectly still. The house was a silent, white enigma against the gray fog. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me this time. It followed me, a cold passenger in my van all the way back to the sorting office. That evening, fueled by a growing unease, I did something I had never done before. I looked up the official postal records for Route 19B. I scanned the digital maps and the printed manifests. Every farm, every remote cottage was there. Except for one. The house at the end, the delivery I made every single day, did not exist in any official capacity. The land it supposedly sat on was listed as an undeveloped, empty plot. A blank space. According to the United States Postal Service, I had been delivering a letter to a ghost every day for the last 3 years. The next morning, another letter for Elias was waiting in my sorting bin. The next day felt different. The weight of the mailbag on my shoulder was the same, but the weight in my mind was new and heavy. Every mundane task of my job now seemed like a prelude to the one that mattered. The drive to Route 19B was filled with a low hum of anxiety. I saw the familiar wall of fog ahead, but today it didn't look like a passive weather phenomenon. It looked like a curtain, deliberately drawn to hide something on a stage. As I drove into it, the silence felt deeper, more intentional. I passed the usual lonely farmhouses, their mailboxes like outstretched, empty hands. My hands felt clammy on the steering wheel. I was just doing my job. I repeated that to myself, but the words felt hollow. When I finally reached the house at the end, it looked exactly as it always did. Perfect, white, and silent. A pristine tomb under a gray sky. But I was looking closer now. Was that a new flower in the window box? A single deep red tulip that I was certain hadn't been there yesterday? Or was my mind, now fertile with suspicion, starting to plant its own seeds of doubt? I took the letter for Elias from my bag. Today, I held it for a moment longer. I ran my thumb over the elegant script. I held it up to the pale, filtered light. It was empty. I knew it. I could feel it. It was a vessel for a message, not a container of paper. The thought made no sense, but it felt true. I walked the gravel path, each crunch of my boots sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. I could feel the windows watching me. I slid the letter into the black mailbox. Click. I raised the red flag, but this time I didn't turn back. I couldn't. The curiosity had become a physical ache, a pressure behind my eyes. I had to know. I got back in my van, drove just around the first bend in the road, and killed the engine. I parked where the van was swallowed by the thick fog, but I still had a clear, if hazy, view of the house's front path. And then I waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The only movement was my own breath fogging up the inside of the windshield. The world seemed to have stopped. There were no birds, no wind, nothing. Just the silent white house and me, a silent observer. I started to feel foolish. What was I expecting? Maybe it was all in my head. The blank manifest, the swaying curtain. Maybe I was just tired. And then, it happened. The front door of the house opened. It didn't creak. It swung inward with a slow, deliberate smoothness that was completely silent. For a long moment, the doorway was just a dark, yawning rectangle. A figure emerged. It was tall and slender, dressed in simple, dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light. I couldn't make out a face or any features. It was like looking at a silhouette cut from shadow. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, gliding over the lawn without disturbing a single blade of grass. It didn't walk to their mailbox. It simply arrived there. It lowered the red flag, its movements precise and economical. It opened the little metal door and retrieved the letter. It held the envelope for a second, not looking at it, but rather holding it as one might hold a dormant butterfly. Then, the figure turned its featureless head and looked directly towards my van. I felt it. It wasn't a gaze of eyes, but a feeling of being perceived, of being known. A cold wave of pure dread washed over me, pinning me to my seat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure turned back, glided to the front door, and disappeared inside. The door swung shut with the same unnerving silence. The house was once again a still, perfect picture. I sat there for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs until the cold forced my shivering hands to turn the key in the ignition. The next morning, I dreaded going to work. I thought about calling in sick, about quitting, about demanding a new route. But I knew I wouldn't. I had to go back. When I got to my sorting station, there was another white envelope addressed to Elias. But this time it wasn't alone. Lying on top of it was a small object that glinted under the fluorescent lights. It was an old-fashioned skeleton key, made of tarnished, heavy brass. It was cold to the touch. There was no note, no explanation. It was just there. An answer to a question I was too afraid to ask, and an invitation I knew I had to accept. The brass key felt heavy in my pocket all day, a constant, cold reminder of the choice I now faced. There was no longer any question of ignoring it. The routine was broken. The mystery had extended a hand, and I had to take it. That afternoon, I didn't return to the sorting office. My route wasn't finished. It felt like it was only just beginning. With the letter for Elias on the passenger seat and the key in my hand, I drove back into the silent embrace of the fog. The world seemed to fade away faster this time. The gray was thicker, clinging to the van like a shroud. The silence was absolute. I felt I had passed a point of no return, that the road back to the familiar world had already vanished behind me. When the house at the end materialized from the mist, it seemed sharper, more real than ever before, as if my decision to engage with it had brought it into focus. I parked the van and stepped out, the single letter and the key feeling like artifacts in a strange ritual. I ignored the mailbox. My feet carried me up the gravel path, directly to the imposing front door. It was made of a dark, rich wood, with an ornate, black iron handle. Below it was a keyhole, dark and waiting. My hand was shaking as I lifted the key. It slid into the lock with a perfect, frictionless fit. I turned it. There was no loud, rusty crank of an old lock. There was only a soft, deep thump, a sound that felt like it came from inside my own chest. I pushed the door, and it swung inward silently, revealing the darkness within. I expected dust, old furniture, the smell of decay. I was wrong. The air inside was cool, clean, and smelled of old paper and ozone, like the moments after a lightning strike. The space I stepped into was impossible. It wasn't a hallway or a foyer. It was a room that stretched into infinity, lined with endless rows of small, dark wood mail slots, reaching higher than any ceiling should. They rose up into a gloom that my eyes couldn't pierce, a vast, silent, and sacred sorting office for the soul. Each slot had a small brass label. I stepped closer to one. The label didn't read a name or an address. It read, "Forgotten Melodies." The one next to it, "Second Thoughts." Further down, I saw misplaced trust, fading scars, and chances not taken. I was standing in a library of everything that had ever been lost. Then I saw it. The tall, slender figure from before was standing at the far end of the central aisle, waiting patiently. It wasn't menacing. It felt calm. As it raised a long, thin arm, it pointed towards a single mail slot at eye level. The label read, "Elias." I understood then. The letters weren't empty. They were carrying something for Elias, a soul so fractured by loss that it needed to be returned piece by piece. My job had been to deliver the potential for healing, the possibility of being whole again. I approached the slot and slid today's letter inside. It vanished with a soft whisper. When I turned back, the figure was gone. In its place on a long sorting table was a single sheet of paper, It was my old route manifest for 19B. All the familiar farmhouses were there, but at the bottom, the blank space had been filled in. It now read, "The Postman." It was a job title. My job title. A new letter suddenly appeared in the alias slot. I pulled it out. It was a simple white envelope, just like all the others. But the elegant script on the front didn't say Elias. It spelled out my own name. I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and peaceful, what my new job was. I was no longer the one who delivered to the house. I was the one who delivered from it. I am the new keeper of this quiet, lonely place. I sort the regrets and the lost hopes, and I send them out to a world I can no longer touch. I am the liminal space postman, and my first delivery is to myself. I have to send back all the pieces of the man I used to be before I can begin my real work. I don't know how many letters are in this archive. Thousands, millions. They arrive every day, silent whispers from your world. I wonder, if I look hard enough, will I find a letter with your name on it? The world shrinks inside a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar at night. It becomes a self-contained universe of recycled air and the low, constant hum of the engines. It's a sound you learn to love, a lullaby at 30,000 feet. My name doesn't matter. I was just one of the many faces trained to smile, to reassure, to serve. Our lives were measured in time zones and coffee pots, a routine so ingrained it felt like breathing. But routine can be a fragile thing. We were a superstitious bunch, us flight crews. We had our rituals, our little luck charms tucked away in our pockets. We had to be. You spend half your life suspended between the earth and the void. You learn to respect the unseen. But this particular plane, this one had more than just rituals. It had a story, a whisper that traveled through the fleet like a phantom current. They said that when Eastern Airlines Flight 401 went down in the black water of the Everglades, the company salvaged what it could. It was practical, economical. Why let perfectly good parts go to waste? Galley ovens, panels, pieces of the landing gear. They were cleaned, certified, and installed into other L-1011s. Our L-1011s. The whispers said the parts weren't all that came back. They said the crew of Flight 401, Captain Bob Loft and Flight Engineer Don Repo, were still on duty. I tried to ignore it. It was just a ghost story, a morbid tale told by tired people on long hauls to keep themselves awake. It was easy to dismiss in the bright, sterile light of the crew lounge. But up here, in the dead of night, the cabin felt different. The air seemed heavier, colder. The smiles of the sleeping passengers looked like fragile masks in the dim blue light. My rounds were mechanical. Check the blankets, collect empty cups, offer a quiet word to the restless. Tonight was a flight from JFK to MIA, the same route Flight 401 had taken. I tried not to think about it. I retreated to the galley, the small metal sanctuary that was my domain. The scent of stale coffee hung in the air, a familiar comfort. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes for just a moment, letting the engine's vibrations seep into my bones. That's when I felt it. A sudden, piercing chill that had nothing to do with the aircraft's air conditioning. It was a localized cold, clinging to the space right in front of the forward oven. Goosebumps erupted on my arms. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I opened my eyes, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. The galley was empty. The stainless steel surfaces reflected the muted cabin lights, distorting my own tired face. Everything was normal. I shook my head, blaming fatigue. These red-eye flights were brutal. You start seeing and feeling things that aren't there. I turned to prepare the fresh pot of coffee, my back to the oven. The feeling of being watched was immense. a heavy pressure between my shoulder blades. I froze, coffee filter in hand. Every instinct screamed at me not to turn around, to just walk out, go back to the cabin, and forget it. But curiosity is a powerful, dangerous thing. I took a slow breath and turned. Nothing. Just the quiet, gleaming galley. And in the polished steel of the oven door, for less than a heartbeat, a man's face stared back at me. Not mine. It was pale with kind, tired eyes that seemed impossibly sad. Then it was gone, replaced by my own wide-eyed, terrified reflection. My breath hitched in my throat. The whispers were real. For a long moment, I could do nothing but stare at my own reflection, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I forced myself to breathe. In, out. It was a trick of the light. A passenger's face caught for a second in the warped steel. It had to be. I splashed cold waters on my face from the small galley sink, the shock of it a welcome anchor to reality. But the image was burned into my mind. The sadness in those eyes. It felt ancient. I stumbled out of the galley, trying to look composed, and nearly collided with Susan, our lead flight attendant. She was a veteran, unflappable. She took one look at my pale face and her professional smile softened with something else. A flicker of understanding. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. I could only nod, unable to form words. She didn't press. She just gently guided me towards the main cabin. "Go take a seat for 5 minutes," she said. "I'll handle this." As I walked away, I felt her eyes on me. And I knew, somehow, that she knew. She had seen things too. The rest of the flight was a blur of forced smiles and autonomic responses. More coffee? Another blanket? My own voice sounded distant, disconnected. The cabin, once a familiar workspace, now felt like a haunted house, each shadow holding a potential secret, each reflection a possible threat. I found myself watching the other passengers. Were they oblivious? Or did they feel the strange chill in the air too? Later, as we began our initial descent, Susan approached me again. Her voice was a low whisper, meant only for me. "I need you to do the final cabin check." It was a routine task, but her eyes held a strange intensity. "And while you're at it, just peek into the flight deck. Don't say anything, just look." My blood ran cold, but I nodded, understanding this was more than a simple request. I walked the length of the aisle, the plane beginning its gentle tilt towards the earth. The passengers were stirring, gathering their things. I offered a few more smiles that didn't reach my eyes before reaching the cockpit door. I knocked softly and opened it just enough to peer inside. The view was always breathtaking. A sea of city lights spread out below us like fallen constellations. Our captain and first officer were focused, their conversation a series of calm, technical call-outs. Everything was normal, except it wasn't. There was a third person in the cockpit, sitting perfectly still in the flight engineer's jump seat. A man in an Eastern Airlines captain's uniform. He wasn't part of our crew. His face was turned towards the window, but I could see his profile, strong, defined, and utterly serene. The captain turned his head slightly, catching my eye in the doorway. "All set back there?" he asked. I blinked, and in that instant, the jump seat was empty. The space where the man had been just moments before now held nothing but empty air. The captain was looking at me, waiting for an answer. "All set, Captain," I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly. I closed the door, my hand shaking. When I returned to the galley, Susan was waiting. She didn't have to ask. The look on my face said everything. "That was Bob," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Captain Loft." My fear was suddenly replaced by a profound, chilling certainty. We weren't just flying with salvaged parts, we were flying with a phantom crew. And as the wheels of the L-1011 touched down on the runway with a gentle bump, I wondered if they were just watching, or if they were helping us land. The walk from the gate to the crew lounge that night was the quietest I've ever experienced. No tired jokes, no complaints about the passengers. Just the soft scuff of our shoes on the polished terminal floor and a shared, unspoken knowledge that hung heavy in the air between us. We didn't talk about it. We couldn't. What would we even say? That our flight was watched over by the dead? We just nodded to each other and went our separate ways. For a few weeks, things were normal. I flew on different aircraft, with different crews. The memory began to feel distant, hazy, like a dream. I almost convinced myself that we had imagined it all, a product of exhaustion and the power of a ghost story. It was easier that way. But then my name appeared on the roster for another overnight flight to the coast. The aircraft assigned was ship number 318, an L-1011. A quiet dread settled in the pit of my stomach. I knew that number. It was one of the planes that had received a large portion of Flight 401's salvaged parts. This time the crew was different. No Susan, no familiar faces who might understand. I was alone with the secret. As I stepped onto the aircraft, the air felt static, charged. I told myself it was my imagination, but the feeling persisted, a low hum of anxiety beneath the surface. The flight took off without incident. We climbed through the dark, a silver needle stitching our way through a blanket of clouds. I performed my duties with a forced efficiency, trying to stay busy, trying not to look too long at any reflective surface. It was halfway through the flight, during the deepest point of the night, when I went to the forward galley to start the coffee service. The moment I stepped inside, I knew. The cold was back. But this time it was more intense, more focused. It wasn't just a passive chill. It felt like an active presence, a will. I stood frozen, my gaze drawn irresistibly to the same oven as before. There was no face this time. There was only a feeling. A deep, powerful, urgent sense of wrongness. It was a feeling of danger, of warning. My heart began to pound in my ears. I looked at the oven's control panel. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No warning lights, no strange sounds. Yet the feeling grew stronger. It was a silent scream in my mind, telling me to look closer. Something is wrong with this oven. The thought wasn't my own. It felt planted there. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the metal casing. It was warmer than it should have been, way too warm for its standby state. I called my lead attendant on the intercom, my voice tight. "I think there's a problem with the forward galley oven. It's overheating." The response was dismissive. "It's probably just a faulty sensor. We can write it up when we land." But I couldn't let it go. The feeling, the presence, was insistent. "No," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "I think you need to come look, now." There was a sigh on the other end, but she agreed. A moment later, she arrived with our flight engineer, both of them looking annoyed at the interruption. The engineer tapped the oven. "Feels a little warm, but it's probably fine." I shook my head, pointing. "Please, just check the wiring behind it." With a roll of his eyes, the engineer got his tools and removed the access panel below the unit. The moment the panel came off, the smell hit us. A sharp, acrid smell of burning plastic. The engineer's expression changed instantly from annoyance to alarm. He shone his flashlight into the space. Tucked deep inside, a bundle of wires had melted together, the insulation scorched black and brittle. It was smoldering, slowly, silently, just moments away from igniting. We had caught it just in time. We averted a potential in-flight fire. The engineer worked quickly to disable the circuit. The lead attendant stared at me, her face pale. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice a hushed whisper. I just looked at the now cool oven, the feeling of the presence gently fading, its duty done. I had no answer for her. I knew it wasn't my intuition. It was a message, delivered from a place I couldn't understand, by a flight engineer who had died in a crash years ago. Don Repo was still on duty, and he had just saved us all. The rest of that flight passed in a thick, reverent silence. The engineer and the lead attendant avoided my gaze, but I could feel them watching me. I was no longer just a colleague. I was something else. A lightning rod. A person who could hear the silence and understand what it was trying to say. When we landed, the official report was filed. It praised my unusual attentiveness and keen intuition in identifying a critical maintenance issue. There was no mention of a cold spot, or a presence, or a ghost. How could there be? These things don't belong in logbooks. But the whispers started again. Not the ghost stories this time, but new whispers about me, about the fire that wasn't. And then, another more interesting rumor began to circulate. Quietly, without any official announcement, Eastern Airlines began removing parts from its L-1011 fleet. Specifically, any component with a serial number that could be traced back to the wreckage of Flight 401. The hauntings, they said, were becoming too credible to ignore. I took some time off after that. I needed to. I would find myself staring into the sky, watching planes fly overhead, and a profound sadness would wash over me. I never felt fear again, not really. What I felt was a strange, melancholic connection to Bob Loft and Don Repo. They weren't monsters. They weren't trying to scare anyone. They were crew, protectors. They had died because of a moment of distraction, a burnt-out light bulb. And in death, they spent their energy trying to prevent it from happening to anyone else, using the very machines that held the last echoes of their lives. I never knew for sure what I experienced. Was it a ghost? Or was it something else? The grief and trauma of 100 souls, so powerful that it imprinted itself onto metal and wire. An echo of consciousness, trapped in a closed loop between this world and the next. I will never have the answer, and perhaps I'm not meant to. Some stories don't have a neat and tidy ending. They simply fade, becoming part of the quiet hum of the world, waiting for someone sensitive enough to listen. These tales live on, not in official reports, but in the hushed conversations in crew lounges late at night, in the silence between heartbeats at 30,000 feet. They live in whispers. If you felt a chill as you listened, if you found yourself holding your breath in the dark, then you understand. You've heard the whisper too. Asphalt is a form of forgetting. You pour it over the past, over the dirt and the roots and the stories buried within. You create a smooth, black, featureless present. My job is to prepare the way for that forgetting. I'm a land surveyor for the Department of Transportation. I walk the old places and draw the new lines for the future. My current project was County Road 39A, a quiet, two-lane road winding through forgotten farmland and sleeping woods. It was scheduled to be widened, a small artery of progress in a place that time had respectfully left alone. The air out there was different. It was heavy still, and smelled of damp earth and something else, something faintly sweet and sad. My equipment was the best money could buy. Laser levels, GPS trackers, total stations that measured angles with impossible precision. The work was routine. I'd set up my tripod, the machine would whir to life, and I'd map out the terrain. But on the third day, along a particular 100-yard stretch shadowed by ancient oak trees, the glitches started. My laser level, a device that never fails, began returning inconsistent elevation readings in one specific area. The numbers would flicker on my data collector, shifting by inches, then feet, as if the ground itself was breathing. I recalibrated everything twice. The error remained, a quiet, illogical ghost in my perfect machine. Then came the whispers. It wasn't a human sound. It was the wind through the tall, dry grass, but it sounded shaped. It was a sound that almost formed words, soft, sibilant sighs that would stop the moment I turned my head to listen properly. I told myself it was just the acoustics of the valley, the wind playing tricks on a lonely man's ears. I started to feel a profound, unshakable sadness in that spot. It wasn't my own emotion. It was an atmospheric pressure, a weight of sorrow. It felt like walking through a place where a great tragedy had occurred, a place where the grief had soaked into the soil itself. I found myself working faster there, an unspoken urgency pushing me to finish and leave before the sun began to set. One afternoon, while driving a survey stake into the ground, my hammer hit something solid only a few inches down. Not a rock. The sound was a dull, hollow thud. I dug away the dirt with my hands and my heart went cold. It was a piece of dark, rotting wood. It looked like the corner of an old, buried coffin. I quickly covered it back up, my hands shaking. I mentioned the equipment glitches in my report. My supervisor dismissed it. Probably magnetic interference from some iron deposit. Just average it out. He didn't want complications. He wanted a clean report that would allow the bulldozers to come in on schedule. He didn't want to hear about feelings or whispers or things that shouldn't be there. No one ever does. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of that rotting wood was burned into my mind. The feeling of that place clung to me like damp clothes. The sadness wasn't just in the field anymore. It was a quiet guest in my silent apartment. I knew I couldn't let it go. On my day off, instead of resting, I drove to the county archives building, a dusty library of forgotten documents. I needed to see the old maps, the original surveys from the 19th century. I had to know what was there before the road. The archivist, a kind woman with gentle eyes, led me to a back room filled with the smell of aging paper and leather. She pulled out a massive, heavy ledger of property maps, dated 1884. "It should be in here," she said. I carefully turned the brittle, yellowed pages, my fingers tracing the faint ink of a world that no longer existed. I found the area, the creek, the hills, the old property lines. It was all there, and right in the middle of that 100-yard stretch, there was a small, hand-drawn rectangle, and inside it, written in elegant, faded script, were two words that made my blood run cold. Mercy's Rest. It wasn't a farm. It was a cemetery, a small, forgotten family cemetery from the 1800s. Mercy's Rest. The two words hung in the dusty air of the archives, heavy with a century of forgotten silence. Suddenly, everything made sense. The equipment glitches, the whispers on the wind, the profound, unexplainable sadness of that place. My scientific mind, which had been fighting to find a logical reason, finally surrendered to a much older, colder truth. The archivist saw the look on my face. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice soft. I could only nod. I took a photo of the map with my phone, the image of that small, hand-drawn rectangle feeling like a forbidden secret. What was I supposed to do? My boss had already told me to ignore the anomalies. This wasn't an anomaly. It was a cemetery. Reporting this would halt a multi-million-dollar project. There would be hearings, investigations, exhumations. It would be a nightmare. My career would likely be over for causing such a delay. But the alternative felt so much worse. To be the one who knowingly drew the lines for a highway to be paved over the top of forgotten graves. I had to go back. I had to be sure. I drove back to Route 39A as the afternoon sun began to dip low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The fog was already rolling in, earlier than usual, clinging to the low ground like a soft gray shroud. When I arrived at this spot, the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer just sad. It felt expectant. I stepped out of my truck, the air cold against my skin. The silence was different now that I knew what it was hiding. It was the silence of a church after the service is over, a quiet filled with unspoken prayers and lingering sorrow. I left my high-tech gear in the truck. It felt inappropriate here. Instead, I took out a simple compass. I walked to the spot where I had found the rotting wood. I held out the compass. The needle trembled, then began to spin wildly, uselessly. It was like standing on a magnetic pole. The laws of physics were being politely ignored in this small patch of land. I knelt down and brushed the soil aside. This time I dug deeper. My fingers found something small, round, and cold. It was a single milky white glass button, the kind you'd find on a simple 19th century dress or a child's shirt. It was so small, so personal. It made the people buried here real. They weren't just data points on an old map anymore. They were families. They were children. They had names and lives, and they were resting here in mercy. As I held the button in my palm, the whispers in the wind grew stronger, clearer. They were no longer just sighs. I could almost hear voices, a chorus of soft murmurs weaving through the trees, just on the edge of my hearing. I closed my eyes, concentrating, trying to pick out a single word from the ghostly tapestry of sound. One word began to repeat itself, rising above the others. It wasn't a frightening word. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. Remember. It was a woman's voice, soft and clear for just a second, before dissolving back into the wind. Remember. A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air shot through me. They weren't trying to scare me away. They were asking for help. They were asking not to be forgotten, to not have their final resting place erased by a layer of black asphalt. My moral dilemma vanished, replaced by a simple, profound certainty. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let this happen. I pulled out my phone to call my supervisor, to tell him everything. Consequences be damned. My thumb hovered over his name. At that exact moment, my phone screen flickered and died. The truck's engine, which I had left running, sputtered and went silent. Every piece of electronic equipment I had with me was suddenly, completely dead. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood there, phone in hand, as the last of the sunlight vanished below the horizon. The fog thickened around me, and at the edge of the woods, standing just where the shadows were deepest, I saw a figure. A tall, slender woman in a simple, old-fashioned dress. The figure of the woman stood perfectly still, a silhouette of sorrow against the deepening twilight. She didn't move. She didn't have to. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her gaze, a profound wave of weariness and a desperate plea to be remembered. It was the collected will of everyone buried here given a face. She was Mercy's rest. My fear dissolved into a quiet, resolute calm. I gave her a small, respectful nod, a silent promise. After a long moment, she seemed to fade back into the shadows, not walking away, but dissolving. The oppressive silence broke. The sound of crickets returned. My truck's dashboard lights flickered back on with a soft chime. My phone was still dead, its battery completely drained. It didn't matter. I knew I had to deliver this message in person. The next morning, I walked into my supervisor's office. I placed the old 1884 map printout on his desk. He glanced at it, annoyed. "I told you to average out the readings, Alex. What is this?" he asked, his voice tight with impatience. "It's a cemetery," I said, my own voice steady. "The spot with the glitches. It's a forgotten family cemetery called Mercy's Rest." He stared at me, his face turning from annoyance to anger. "Are you serious? You're going to hold up a state project because of a smudge on a 100-year-old map?" I didn't argue. I simply reached into my pocket and placed the small, milky white glass button on the map, right next to the hand-drawn rectangle. He looked at the button. It was so small, so insignificant, yet so undeniably real. His anger faltered, replaced by a weary disbelief. The fight that followed was quiet but intense. There were threats to my career, accusations of insubordination. I stood my ground. I filed an official report, citing the map and the physical artifact. The project was halted, pending an archaeological survey. My supervisor told me I was finished, that I'd never work for the state again. Maybe he was right. But I walked out of that office feeling lighter than I had in years. A few months passed. The survey confirmed everything. They found 13 graves, simple, unmarked plots, right where the map said they would be. The descendants of the family were tracked down. The remains were carefully, respectfully moved to a modern cemetery, finally given proper names. The project was rerouted. The 100-yard stretch of Route 39A was left untouched, the ancient oaks still standing guard. I drove out there one last time on a bright autumn afternoon. The air was different. The heavy sadness was gone. The whispers in the wind were just wind now. The place was no longer a restless grave. It was just a quiet piece of land at peace. The state didn't fire me. They transferred me to the Historical Records Department. My new job is to review old surveys before new projects begin, to make sure we don't pave over any more forgotten stories. It seems they decided it's cheaper than halting construction. I am no longer just the man who draws lines. I am a keeper of memories. I listen to the land before we ask it to forget. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other quiet places are there, under our feet, in our own towns and cities? It all began on a Tuesday, a day so painfully ordinary that its memory feels like a faded photograph from someone else's life. The sun was casting long, gentle shadows across our kitchen floor, and the scent of toast hung in the air, a scent of home. My husband Leo sat across from me at our small oak table, his familiar face etched with the lines of a shared decade. Everything was perfect, a fragile snow globe of domestic peace, just before the first violent shake. It started with the coffee. For 10 years, Leo had despised the drink, its bitter smell always making him wrinkle his nose in a way I found endearing. He called it burnt bean water, a silly phrase that became one of our little inside jokes, a testament to our intertwined lives. Yet on this Tuesday morning, he sat across from me, sipping it black as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I must have been staring, because he looked up from his mug, his brow furrowed in a way that was almost, but not quite, his. "What is it, Ilara?" he asked, and his voice was the same melody I knew by heart, but a single note was flat, almost imperceptible. I forced a laugh, a brittle sound in the quiet room, trying to dismiss the cold prickle crawling up my spine. "You're drinking coffee." He glanced down at the dark liquid, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, a brief moment of intellectual assessment. "I guess I am," he said with a small shrug, a gesture that was too loose, too casual for the man I knew. People change. But Leo didn't change like that. He was a man of comfortable routines and fierce loyalties to his own tastes, a human anchor. That single wrong detail was a tiny crack in the mirror of my reality, a hairline fracture I couldn't stop tracing with my mind. The day continued, and I tried to bury the unease under a pile of work emails and household chores, telling myself it was nothing. I found his favorite gray sweater, the one with the worn-out elbows, neatly folded in a donation pile by the door. He loved that sweater. That evening, as we sat on the sofa, the city lights painting patterns on our wall, I brought up our first vacation together. I reminisced about the little restaurant in Lisbon where we'd been caught in a rainstorm, laughing as we ate grilled sardines. He smiled, but it was a polite, distant smile. The kind you give a stranger telling a story you don't quite follow. "I don't really remember the rain," he said, his gaze fixed on the television screen, not on me. "Are you sure that was Lisbon?" My blood ran cold. That memory was a cornerstone of our relationship, a story we'd recounted dozens of times. For him to not remember, it was like a historian forgetting a war, a painter forgetting the color blue. It was impossible. I felt a chasm open between us on that sofa, an invisible, silent gap that was suddenly miles wide. My Leo was in there somewhere. I started watching him then, not as a wife, but as a scientist observing an anomaly, a detective studying a suspect. I noticed how he now slept on his back, perfectly still, when for years he had been a restless side sleeper, always stealing the blankets. I noticed how he no longer hummed, a constant, tuneless sound that used to be the background music to our life at home. The silence he left in its place was deafening, a void where something familiar should have been. It was an erasure. One night, I watched him sleep, the moonlight casting his features in silver and shadow, a perfect marble sculpture of my husband. His face was flawless, every line and pore exactly where it should be, a mask of perfect identity. But his chest rose and fell with a rhythm that was too steady. It was the metronomic breathing of something deeply, profoundly at rest. It was the breathing of something that did not dream. Fear, true and sharp, pierced through my denial. This wasn't my husband. This was something wearing his skin like a well-tailored suit. The next day, I began my search for proof, my hands trembling as I unlocked his phone while he was in the shower. I scrolled through his messages and photos, my heart pounding, looking for a mistake, a slip-up, anything to expose the imposter. But there was nothing. Every text was plausible, every email mundane. The performance was flawless, airtight. It was almost disappointing. It made me question my own mind, a terrifying thought that this fog of wrongness was a product of my own unraveling psyche. Was I the one who was broken? The thought was a brief, seductive comfort, a way out of this waking nightmare. The relief was shattered when I went to look for our old photo albums, hidden away in the top of our shared closet. I reached for the familiar worn shoebox, the one labeled Us, filled with faded Polaroids and glossy prints of our past. My fingers brushed against something else, a different box, small, wooden, and cold to the touch. I had never seen it before in my life. My breath hitched. It was tucked away behind his winter coats, a deliberate act of concealment in our most private space. With trembling hands, I pulled the wooden box down, dust motes dancing in the single beam of light from the hallway. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid, my mind racing with possibilities. Old letters from a past lover, a hidden memento. The reality was far stranger. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a single peculiar object. It was a small, intricately carved bird's skull made not of bone, but of a smooth, pearlescent material that seemed to drink the light. And threaded through its empty eye sockets was a lock of hair. It was my hair, I knew the exact shade of auburn, the slight curl at the end. I felt a wave of vertigo so intense I had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. This was not a memory. This was a threat. I heard the shower stop. The sound of the bathroom door opening echoed down the hall like a judge's gavel. I had to put it back. My movements were frantic as I shoved the skull back in the box, closed the lid, and pushed it back into its hiding place. I stumbled out of this closet just as he walked into the bedroom, a towel around his waist, water dripping from his hair onto the floor. He looked at me, his head tilted slightly, that same analytical gaze returning, assessing my flushed face and ragged breathing. "Everything okay, Alara?" he asked, his voice a calm, placid lake on the surface of which I could now see a million monstrous things reflected. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with terror. The lie felt like swallowing glass. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. Those cold, familiar eyes. The smile remained on his face for a moment too long. A perfect, predatory curve. I felt like a mouse being studied by an owl. That night, sleep was not a refuge, but a different kind of vigil. I lay beside him, my back rigid, listening to his unnaturally steady breathing. I was sharing a bed with a question mark, a monster dressed in memories, and the warmth from his body felt like the heat from a furnace. I pretended to be asleep when he rose just before dawn, a time he never once woke in 10 years of our life together. I watched through slitted eyes as he moved not towards the bathroom or kitchen, but to the large mirror hanging on our bedroom wall. He stood before it, perfectly still, his silhouette a dark shape against the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the window. He wasn't admiring his reflection. He was studying it with an unnerving intensity, as if checking the seams of a disguise. Then he did something that made the air freeze in my lungs. He raised a hand and slowly, deliberately, pressed his face against the cold glass. It was a gesture of profound strangeness, intimate and alien. He stayed like that for a full minute, just breathing onto the mirror. He wasn't looking at himself. He was looking through the glass, as if expecting to see something else on the other side. When he finally pulled away, there was no breath fog on the mirror, not a single trace of condensation. It was as if he had no warmth, no life to give. My carefully constructed denial shattered into a million pieces. This was real. It was happening. And I was utterly, completely alone. My paranoia began to bleed out from him and into the world around me. The very fabric of my home started to feel subtly wrong. A crack in the ceiling I'd never noticed before seemed to form the shape of a leering eye. The house settled with groans that sounded like whispers. The ticking of our grandfather clock in the hall no longer felt comforting, but like a countdown to something dreadful. I felt like the protagonist of a ghost story, haunted not by a spirit, but by the slow, creeping corruption of my own reality. I needed an anchor, an outside perspective. I decided to call his mother, a woman who knew her son better than anyone. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number, my mind racing to invent a casual reason for my call. My excuse was a question about an old family recipe. "Oh, Leo's a wonderful boy," she said, her voice warm and familiar over the phone. "He called me just yesterday, in fact." My heart skipped a beat. Leo hated talking on the phone. He always made me do it. That was another piece that didn't fit. He sounded so good, Alara," she continued, oblivious to my turmoil. "So clear. Usually he mumbles, you know? It's like he's a new man." Her words were meant as a compliment, but to me, they were a confirmation. A new man. She had no idea how literal that phrase was. The call ended with pleasantries that felt like lies. I hung up, the silence of the apartment pressing in on me, more isolated than ever. This thing, this entity, it wasn't just performing everyone, weaving a new reality around itself. It tried to lull me back into a false sense of security. It brought me my favorite flowers, white lilies, for no reason at all. The real Leo hadn't done that in years. The gesture was so tender, so reminiscent of our early days, that it made me want to weep with confusion. For a fleeting moment, I let myself believe. Maybe he was just trying. Maybe I was losing my mind. The doubt was a sweet poison. He cooked my favorite meal that night, the one he always struggled with, and it was perfect. Every flavor was exact, too exact. Humans are defined by their beautiful imperfections, their small, consistent errors. My Leo always added too much garlic, always. This creature's perfection was more terrifying than any mistake. It was the flawless work of a machine, a mimic learning its part with terrifying precision. My resolve hardened. I had to find out what it was, where it came from. The why was a luxury I couldn't afford. I needed the what. My search took me to the internet, into the dark corners of forums dedicated to the uncanny and the unexplained. I typed in phrases that felt insane: husband replaced, loved one feels like a stranger, doppelganger, changeling folklore. I waded through hours of fiction and delusion until I found a small, obscure forum, a digital ghost town of forgotten posts. The design was ancient, from the early days of the web. The topic was tulpas, doppelgangers, and other echoes. Most threads were years old. One post, dated 6 years ago, caught my eye. The title was, "It's Wearing My Brother's Face." My blood turned to ice. The story was eerily similar to mine. Small changes in personality, forgotten memories, a feeling of wrongness that no one else could see. The user described his brother becoming a perfected version of himself, excelling at everything he used to fail at. The post ended with the chilling warning: "Don't let it know you know. They hate being seen. They are echoes that want to become the source." But it was the last sentence that truly terrified me. Check the mirrors. They use them to anchor. They have to report back. A cold dread washed over me as I remembered Leo, his face pressed against the glass. The absence of fog. He wasn't looking through. He was reporting. I scrolled down, desperate for more. The user's account was no longer active. His last post was that single, desperate warning. I needed to see it for myself. I needed to catch it in the act. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But now it was mixed with something else. Anger. I bought a tiny spy camera, the kind that looks like a USB charger. My plan was simple and insane. I would plug it in our bedroom, directly across from the large mirror he seemed so drawn to. I had to see what he did when he thought I was asleep. Setting it up felt like signing my own death warrant. My hands were slick with sweat as I plugged it into the wall socket. That night, I feigned sleep more convincingly than I ever had in my life, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I listened as he rose from the bed again in the dead of night, the floorboards groaning softly under his weight. I waited. The silence stretched for an eternity. When I finally dared to check the footage the next day, my soul went cold. There he was, standing in front of the mirror in the grainy night vision footage. His back was to the camera. He was perfectly still. Then, his reflection moved. It moved on its own. It turned its head slowly, its eyes glowing white in the infrared, staring directly at the camera. My husband's reflection looked right at me, and it smiled, a wide, predatory smile, full of an ancient and terrible knowledge. It knew I was watching. My scream was a silent one, trapped in my throat. I threw the laptop shut as if the image could crawl out of the screen. The reflection knew. The thing wearing my husband's face knew that I knew. The game of cat and mouse was over. Now, I was just the mouse. I sat there on the floor, paralyzed by a new, more profound terror. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. My home was a tomb. I heard his footsteps approaching the home office, slow, deliberate. Each one a nail being hammered into the coffin of my old life. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and stood there, leaning against the frame. He was fully dressed, wearing the clothes I had laid out for him. The polite, confused mask was gone from his face. In its place was an expression of ancient, patient intelligence. It was a look of ownership. "You were not supposed to see that, Ilara," he said, and his voice was different now. It was Leo's voice, but with all the warmth stripped away. It was a perfect recording, a playback. It complicates the observation period. It introduces a variable. My mind reeled. Observation period, variable. He spoke of our life together as if it were a laboratory experiment. "What are you?" I finally whispered, the words scraping my throat. The question felt impossibly small in the face of what stood before me. It smiled, a thin, humorless line. A replacement, an echo, a corrective measure. I am what happens when a space becomes available. It stepped into the room, its movements fluid and economical. The man you called Leo was fading. His patterns became weak, his love inconsistent. "I am a much better version," it continued, stopping a few feet from me. "I don't forget anniversaries. I am attentive. I am perfect. Isn't that what you wanted?" The logic was so cold, so monstrous, it made my skin crawl. It had studied us, studied our desires, and weaponized love itself. "The universe does not abide a vacuum," it said, gesturing vaguely at the room around us. "It fills it with a stronger signal." I scrambled backwards, away from it, until my back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to go. My mind screamed one word: run. I had to escape. I glanced towards the window, but it seemed to watch my gaze, understanding my intent before I had fully formed it. "You can leave, of course," it said, its tone deceptively gentle, as if offering me a cup of tea. "The observation is complete, after all." It stepped aside, clearing a path to the door. This was a trick. It had to be a trick. A predator does not simply let its prey walk away. But what choice did I have? I rose on shaky legs, my eyes never leaving its calm, unblinking face, and walked slowly towards the hallway. Every instinct screamed that it would grab me, that its hand would clamp down on my shoulder. But nothing happened. I reached the front door, my hand trembling as I fumbled with the deadbolt. The click of the lock retracting was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. I pulled the door open, and the cool night air hit my face, a shock to my system. It smelled of freedom. I took one step onto the porch. Just one thing, Ilara," its voice echoed from behind me, stopping me dead in my tracks. "A souvenir of my time here." I turned back slowly. It was standing in the doorway, holding the small wooden box. It opened the lid, revealing the pearlescent bird skull. "You are a much stronger signal than he was," it said, its eyes glowing with a faint light of their own. So much passion, so much fear. It's beautiful. It wasn't looking at me. It was looking past me, at my reflection in the dark glass of the living room window. And I finally understood. The observation wasn't for it to learn about Leo. The observation of my love and terror was to learn about me. He wasn't the experiment. I was. "An echo needs a source," it whispered, and its voice seemed to come from right beside my ear, even though it hadn't moved. A dizzying wave of vertigo washed over me, the world tilting on its axis. The feeling of wrongness wasn't just about him, it was inside me. I stumbled away from the house. running without looking back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I ran until the streetlights blurred into streaks of fire. I found a small, cheap motel on the edge of town and locked myself in the bathroom, my back pressed against the door, gasping for air. I finally looked up into the grimy mirror above the sink, needing to see a familiar face, to see myself. My own eyes stared back at me. But as I watched, my reflection's head tilted, just a fraction of an inch, in a way I didn't command. A slow, knowing smile spread across its face. My face. The same smile I saw in the footage, the same smile from the thing in my house. And in the terrifying silence of that motel room, I heard a soft, familiar whisper come from my own throat. The observation is complete. Look closely at the faces of those you trust. Lean in and listen to the rhythm of their breathing while they sleep. The world was white and silent, a pristine, endless white that stretched from the tips of our skis to the jagged peaks that clawed at the pale sky. My name is Yuri, and I was just one of 9, our hearts beating with the rhythm of adventure. We were young, filled with the kind of reckless optimism that only youth can afford. The crisp air burned our lungs in the most pleasant way, a clean, sharp sting that reminded us we were alive. Our laughter echoed in the vast emptiness of the Ural Mountains, a fleeting sound against the ancient silence of the slopes. We were a tight-knit group, knit together by the shared love for the untamed wild. Igor, our leader, was the steady hand, his gaze always fixed on the horizon, his confidence a beacon for us all. The first few days were a blur of strenuous trekking and joyful camaraderie. We would ski until our muscles ached and our faces were numb from the wind, then gather in the evenings, huddled close for warmth. The fire would crackle and spit, casting dancing shadows that played upon our smiling faces as we shared stories and sipped hot tea. Zina would play her mandolin, a sweet, melancholic sound that seemed to hang in the frozen air long after the last note was played. We felt invincible, masters of this frozen kingdom. The mountain, in its majestic beauty, felt like a benevolent giant watching over us. But even then, in those early, happy moments, a subtle disquiet began to thread its way into the fabric of our journey. It was a feeling I couldn't quite name, a whisper at the edge of hearing. It started with the silence. Not the peaceful, comforting silence of a winter wilderness, but a heavy, expectant hush that seemed to swallow all sound. Even our own voices, our laughter, felt muffled, as if the air itself was too dense to carry the vibrations. Sometimes, I would turn my head quickly, certain I had heard a footstep just behind me, but there was only the endless, undisturbed snow. The local Mansi hunters we'd met briefly before our final push had warned us. They spoke of this mountain, Kholat Syakhl, the mountain of the dead, with a quiet reverence and fear. They spoke of spirits, of strange forces that did not welcome outsiders. We, in our modern arrogance, had dismissed their words as folklore, charming tales for a winter's night. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, painting the snow in hues of orange and violet, we saw them, strange lights in the sky. They were not stars, nor were they any aircraft we could identify. They were glowing orbs, moving in slow, deliberate patterns against the darkening canvas of the sky. We stood mesmerized, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Igor tried to rationalize it, suggesting it could be some sort of military test, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. The lights vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind a profound sense of unease. The mountain no longer felt like a benevolent giant. It felt like an entity, ancient and aware, and its eyes were now fixed upon us. That night, sleep did not come easily. The wind howled a mournful song against the fabric of our tent, a sound that seemed to carry with it a warning. I lay there, listening, and I could hear the restless stirring of the others. The shared, unspoken fear was a tangible presence in the cramped space. I remember closing my eyes and seeing those strange, silent orbs dancing in the darkness behind my eyelids. The feeling of being watched intensified, a suffocating pressure that made each breath a conscious effort. The sense of a normal expedition was gone, replaced by a creeping dread. We were no longer just climbers on a mountain. We were intruders in a place that did not want us, and the boundary between the natural and the inexplicable was beginning to dissolve around us. The real journey, the one into fear, was just beginning. The following morning brought a deceptive calm, the sky a fragile, pale blue. But the oppressive silence remained, heavier than before. We pushed onward, deeper into the embrace of the mountains, but the landscape began to feel alien, hostile. The trees grew sparse, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, like skeletal arms reaching out from the snow. The joy of the trek had curdled into a grim determination to simply move forward, to escape the palpable sense of being scrutinized. Igor, our unshakable leader, now consulted his map with a frequency that betrayed his own growing uncertainty. A wrong turn was made. I don't know if it was the magnetic pull of the mountain or a simple human error, but we veered off our intended path, drawn towards the barren, windswept slopes of Kholat Syakhl. It was a decision that felt both wrong and inevitable, as if our feet were being guided by a will that was not our own. The wind picked up, a low, guttural moan that grew into a furious shriek. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal torrent that stung our exposed skin and reduced visibility to almost zero. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. We were walking blind, a tiny, fragile line of humanity against the raw, untamed power of the storm. The cold was a physical entity, seeping through our layers of clothing, leaching the warmth from our very bones. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of my composure. We were lost, hopelessly, terrifyingly lost. It was Igor who made the call to set up camp. It seemed like madness. The slope was exposed, offering no protection from the relentless gale. Standard procedure, the very rules of survival we had all sworn by, dictated that we should retreat to the relative safety of the forest line below. But we didn't. We began to pitch the tent right there, on that desolate, angled expanse of snow, as the storm raged around us with demonic fury. Our fingers were numb, clumsy, fumbling with the frozen canvas and poles. Every gust of wind threatened to tear the tent from our grasp and send it hurtling into the white abyss. There was a desperation in our movements, a frantic energy born not of hope, but of sheer terror. Looking back, I cannot explain the logic. It felt as though the mountain itself had pinned us to its side, refusing to let us go. The decision was not born of strategy, but of a complete surrender to some unseen force. It was as if our collective will had been eroded, leaving only the instinct to huddle together against the encroaching darkness. Finally, the tent was up, a fragile, pathetic shelter against the immense power of the wilderness. We stumbled inside, collapsing on top of one another in the cramped semi-darkness, the sound of the wind a deafening roar. We were exhausted, frozen, and saturated with a deep, primal fear. But we were together. We had our shelter. For a fleeting moment, a tiny flicker of relief. We prepared for what we thought would be a simple, albeit harsh, night. We tried to eat, but our hands trembled too much to hold our utensils steady. The conversation was sparse, strained. each of us lost in our own fearful thoughts. The orange glow of our small stove cast long, distorted shadows on the tent walls, making us all look like strangers to one another. And then, the sound began. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the ground beneath us, traveling up through the snow, through our bodies, and into our teeth. It was a deep, unsettling hum, accompanied by a crushing pressure that made the air in the tent feel thick and heavy, as if the mountain itself was beginning to groan in its sleep, and we were trapped upon its chest. Inside the tent, the air grew thick with a fear so potent it was almost liquid. The low vibrational hum was no longer just a sound. It was a physical presence. It resonated in our skulls, making our thoughts scatter like frightened birds. We looked at each other, our eyes wide in the flickering lamplight, seeing our own terror reflected back. The crushing pressure intensified, as if the weight of the entire sky was settling upon our fragile shelter. It became hard to breathe, each inhale a struggle against an invisible force. We were trapped, mice in a box that was slowly being squeezed. Outside, the storm raged on, but its fury felt distant, secondary to the immediate internal horror that was unfolding. The threat was no longer outside. It was with us. Then, a light bloomed against the tent's canvas. It wasn't the cold, white light of a flare or a searchlight. It was a brilliant, searing orange, impossibly bright, that pulsed in time with the deep hum. It bathed our tiny space in a sickening, otherworldly glow, erasing all shadows and exposing the raw fear on every face. The light felt intelligent, invasive. It seemed to press against the fabric, not with heat, but with a palpable energy that made the hairs on our arms stand on end. We shrank back from the walls of the tent, huddling together in the center, a knot of pure animal terror. There were no screams. Our voices were stolen by the vibrating air, our throats constricted by a fear too profound for sound. And then the noise came. It wasn't just a sound, it was an assault. A deafening infrasonic wave that bypassed our ears and struck directly at our core. It was a sound you felt in your bones, in your organs. A violent, tearing sensation that threatened to rip us apart from the inside. It was the sound of reality itself being torn. In that moment, all rationality, all training, all discipline evaporated. The 9 of us, experienced hikers and students of science, were reduced to nothing more than primal instinct. The civilized mind shattered, leaving only one overwhelming impulse: escape. The tent was no longer a shelter. It was a tomb. It was the source of the agony. We had to get out. I don't remember who produced the knife. Perhaps it was several of us at once. I just remember the glint of steel in that hellish orange light. There was no time to fumble with the frozen zipper, no thought of the logical exit. The tent itself had become the enemy, the membrane containing the horror. A hand, desperate and shaking, slashed downwards. The sound of the canvas ripping was a sharp counterpoint to the deep, soul-shattering hum. One slash, then another. An opening was torn into our world, a dark, gaping wound leading out into the chaos of the storm. It was an escape into a different kind of death, but it was an escape nonetheless. A wave of frigid air and swirling snow blasted into the tent, a momentary shock that broke the paralysis. One by one, we scrambled, crawled, and pushed our way through the jagged tear in the fabric. There was no thought for boots, for coats, for survival gear. Some were in their socks, others completely barefoot. We burst from the suffocating orange glow of the tent into the screaming black and white maelstrom of the blizzard. The terrifying hum and the blinding light were gone, but they were replaced by the howling wind and the bite of a cold so extreme it felt like fire. We ran, stumbling and falling, away from the tent, away from that spot on the mountainside, fleeing into the lethal embrace of the polar night with nothing but the terror in our hearts to drive us on. The forest line. It was our only goal, a dark, serrated edge barely visible through the swirling snow. We half ran, half fell down the steep slope, the icy crust of the snow tearing at our bare feet and hands. The adrenaline that had propelled us from the tent was already fading, replaced by a deep, invasive cold that felt ancient and absolute. The wind was a physical blow, stealing the air from our lungs, its howl a symphony of utter desolation. We were no longer a group, but a scattered collection of terrified souls, each isolated in their own bubble of suffering. I could hear faint cries, names being called out, but the wind snatched them away instantly. Somehow, a few of us reached the tree line, stumbling towards the temporary shelter of a huge ancient cedar. Its branches, heavy with snow, offered a meager shield against the storm. I remember seeing Georgi and another Yuri, my namesake, frantically trying to start a fire. They broke off lower branches, their hands raw and bleeding, their movements clumsy with cold. A tiny flame flickered to life, a pathetic spark of defiance in the overwhelming dark. We huddled around it, but its heat was a ghost, a mere suggestion of warmth that could not penetrate the profound chill that had settled deep in our marrow. My body had begun to betray me in strange ways. The shivering that had racked my frame uncontrollably started to subside, replaced by a dangerous, creeping numbness. A strange sense of lethargy washed over me. This is where my memory begins to fray, the edges blurring into a delirious nightmare. The fire was failing. The desperate efforts to climb the cedar for more wood ended in falls, in broken limbs. There was a strange disconnect between my mind and my body. I felt a bizarre urge to take off my sweater, a phantom sensation of burning heat spreading across my skin, even as I knew I was freezing to death. I saw Igor, our leader, trying to rally the others, his face a mask of grim resolve. He wanted us to return to the tent, a suicidal notion, but one born of a leader's desperate need to do something. Some followed him, a small, doomed procession staggering back up the slope into the heart of the storm. I did not. I could not. I remember stumbling away from the dying fire, away from the cedar, drawn by an unseen current towards the deeper darkness of the ravine. Time lost all meaning. Was it minutes or hours? The forest became a labyrinth of menacing shapes, the trees like silent, judgmental figures. I was alone now, truly alone. The pain in my feet had vanished, and when I looked down, I couldn't feel the snow anymore. My mind began to play tricks on me. I saw lights again, not the terrifying orange orb, but soft, gentle lights dancing between the trees, like distant lanterns. They seemed to beckon me forward, promising warmth, promising rest. I fell into a deep snowdrift at the edge of the ravine. The struggle was over. A strange and profound peace settled over me, a gentle acceptance of the end. The howling of the wind faded to a soft whisper. It was almost comfortable. I was just so tired. I closed my eyes, letting the heavy blanket of snow cover me. But just before the darkness took me completely, one final image burned itself into my fading consciousness. I wasn't looking at the trees or the sky. I was looking down at my own chest, and in the strange, pearlescent light of the snow, I saw it. My rib cage. It felt wrong, crushed inward by a force that had left no mark upon my skin. And I understood, in that last lucid moment, that the thing on the mountain, the humming, the light, it hadn't just scared us, it had touched us. The snows melted. Spring, hesitant and slow, began to reclaim the mountain, revealing the secrets the winter had tried to keep. My voice now is just a whisper on the wind that still blows across this slope, a faint echo of the life that was violently extinguished here. I watched as they came, the searchers, their faces etched with grim concern. They found our tent first, a collapsed and frozen ruin, slashed open from the inside, a monument to our final moments of shared terror. Our belongings, our skis, our food, all left behind, testament to a flight not from hunger or cold, but from something far, far worse. They followed the trail of our desperate footprints, a scattered line leading from the tent down towards the tree line, a path of 9 souls fleeing into oblivion. They found my body and Georgie's under the great cedar, our hands burned and broken from the futile attempt to conjure fire. They noted we were stripped to our underwear. They couldn't understand it. They called it paradoxical undressing, a trick of extreme hypothermia, but it wasn't the cold that made us feel like we were burning. Then they found Igor, Zina, and Rustam, spaced out on the long, lonely climb back towards the tent. Frozen statues pointing the way to their own tomb, their lives given in a last, hopeless attempt to seek shelter. For months, the mountain held the rest of us in its embrace. But the spring sun is persistent. It thawed the deep snows in the ravine. It was there they found the last 4 of us, buried under more than 4 meters of snow. And it was here that the mystery deepened into something dark and unfathomable. We had injuries that no fall, no simple force of nature could explain. Crushed ribs and fractured skulls, sustained with the force of a car crash, yet with no external wounds, no bruising on the skin. Lyudmila was found without her tongue. The official report would be vague, speaking of animals after death. But there were no tracks, no signs of a struggle. It was clinical, precise. They closed the investigation. The final verdict, a phrase as empty and vast as the sky above us. Death by a compelling natural force. A natural force. That is what they called the humming vibration that shook our souls. That is what they named the silent, searing orange light that drove us mad. That is their explanation for the invisible giant that crushed the life from us in the dark ravine. They do not understand. They cannot. They see a tragedy, a mountaineering accident. I see a warning. This mountain, this place, is a borderland. It is a place where the veil between worlds is thin. We crossed a threshold we were never meant to cross. We were not killed by the cold or the wind. We were silenced. Silenced because we saw something we shouldn't have. My story is over. It has melted with the snows and now flows in the streams that run down this slope. It is whispered by the leaves on the stunted trees. If you find yourself in a quiet, wild place, and the silence suddenly feels too loud, and you feel the weight of unseen eyes upon you, perhaps you will think of us. Think of the 9 smiles in a fading photograph, frozen in time, just before the world turned white and the humming began. We are a part of the mountain's story now, an eternal echo of fear on the mountain of the dead. The whispers on this mountain never truly fade. They become stories, carried on the wind, waiting for someone to listen. If our echo has reached you, let it be known. Press the like button so this story may travel further than we ever could. And subscribe to become a keeper of the whispers that linger in the world's forgotten corners, lest they be silenced forever.